Test. Hi. My name is Joseph. I work with the Ethereum Foundation, and I'm going to be moderating this panel. It's covering a lot in the way of topics. We have a fun background. What are we doing? AV. We're going to try and cover a number of topics in a very short time window. So apologies if we hop around too much, but in general, we're going to start with stablecoins, try and work our way into identity, and end with how these things relate to the networks that these use cases are built on top of. So without further ado, we'll dive right in. On stablecoins, I'm going to break this into two columns. One is the institutional side and the sort of mass onboarding events that may take place through banks and enterprises and institutions, and the other is more peer-to-peer use. Starting on the institutional side, the first question is how dominant you think this segment will be versus peer-to-peer use you see in developing economies and user-to-user. And do you think that regardless of how massive the institutional side may be, whether it'll be complementary, for example, if it adds a lot in the way of liquidity into existing on-chain applications? I'll start with Marek.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You know, I think both will be obviously really massive, and I think it also depends a little bit what you mean by institutional. If you mean institutions launching their own stablecoins, or if you mean companies trading with each other using other stablecoins. But certainly, at Celo, we're very, very excited about the peer-to-peer use case. We think that it's a really important use case that crypto enables, especially in markets where people have been excluded from the financial rails that I think a lot of people here probably take for granted. And so we're very, very bullish on the peer-to-peer use cases. And certainly we've had a lot of success with that. We've partnered with Opera, this browser company that you might know, who have launched a stablecoin-only wallet. And that wallet now has 7 million users that are really using it the way that maybe folks here are using Revolut, or people in the US are using Venmo. Transacting in a peer-to-peer fashion, using phone numbers as identifiers, and sending only stablecoins. I think our thesis is the same thing that happened with WhatsApp, right? With WhatsApp, people started texting in places where SMS messages were expensive, but because people communicate across borders, ultimately the network effects of WhatsApp grew from those markets where texting was expensive to all markets, even when texting was free in those markets. And we think the same thing will happen with P2P payments on-chain. We think that we're getting to the point where it won't be long before everyone in the world has a self-custodial wallet that they use to transact peer-to-peer with their family, with their friends, potentially also, with other companies, potentially also receiving income from other companies. And we think that, that's one, just an incredibly exciting future, but two, I mean, it's also going to be crazy that we're going to be living in a time soon where we're going to be thinking back, oh my God, we used to live in a world where it wasn't easy to send, stable value to anyone in the world. And that's just really, really exciting.
I'd ask the same question to Vitalik. Do you believe that we're about to see a mass onboarding event into the stablecoin space, whether it's through the US legislation a lot of folks have been talking about, or relatedly, Robinhood launching a stablecoin, PayPal launching a stablecoin, and how will this interplay with existing peer-to-peer use?
Yeah, I think, we've seen for quite a while now that there's been growing institutional use and growing peer-to-peer use. And so far, it feels like they've been like not really interfering with each other, right? And in some cases, I think in a lot of cases, even complementary with each other, right? Because one often provides the network effects for the other. I mean, we've definitely been seeing like some degree of kind of separation between what kind of assets different groups use, right? And like the crowds that use USDC versus USDT are like very different. But otherwise, I don't know. Like, I haven't really seen any signs of negative interference between the two. I think there's like a lot of good cases of like positive reinforcement between the two, and like generally they'll just like people doing both in like both camps have their own valid reasons too, and I expect that that'll continue growing.
They're complementary, like Vitalik in a Marek shirt, and Marek in a Vitalik shirt, for those who hadn't seen yet. We were chatting earlier about, so Zello, you mentioned, has 18 stablecoins on it at the moment. We'll dig into that in just a minute, but most of the volume right now exists through, Vitalik mentioned, these different audiences. Some are playing with things like USDT and some with USDC. Do you think that the first mover advantage will keep those as the primary stablecoins that we use around the world? Will we see baskets? Do you think that decentralized alternatives will take a major market share? Will some of the banks that are jumping in to compete with Tether's, earnings per employee, which have been pretty crazy, will begin to compete there, or bank consortiums? What do you think the stablecoin space looks like in a couple of years?
I think network effects are huge. I think Tether and USDC are probably going to remain the dominant stablecoins globally. We have seen efforts, as you mentioned, Anchorage, I think, teamed up with Robinhood and Kraken to launch the global USD. And certainly as more banks get involved, they're probably going to be thinking about launching their own stablecoins too, to allow their customers to hold assets in those stablecoins. But will they be the stablecoins that people transact with or companies transact with? I highly suspect no. I suspect that ultimately the network effects of Tether and USDC are going to be the ones that keep both of those just at the top. But what's interesting is, I think as more countries and populations come on chain, I think the very fact that people really appreciate accounting in kind of a unit of account that they know means that we probably will see just a lot more stablecoins for other markets as well. And so, you mentioned the 18 stablecoins that are on Celo, where there's protocols on Celo that are launching more and more stablecoins. We're very, very excited about people in every market in the world being able to use their own stablecoins as a unit of account, while still being able to go back and forth between dollar-based stablecoins or euro-based stablecoins if and when they need, but at least having that unit of account when they want it. And I think, again, like with the peer-to-peer use cases, that's just going to become a lot more exciting. It's just difficult to roll out today because I think until you have really strong network effects where people are transacting with these things, you need to focus on the single player use cases. And the single player use case for holding a local currency stablecoin is not really that appealing. Holding a US dollar stablecoin in a market where you have a lot of inflation, that is very appealing, and we're seeing a lot of people doing that. But until all your friends and loved ones and everyone that you know are on chain, you're probably not going to have that value for those local currency stablecoins. But we're right at that moment where this is going to change, and that is what is really exciting.
But to Vitalik, would you agree that USDC and USDT's early lead sort of carry them at least on the US dollar front? Or there was a story earlier this week that a lot of large banks and institutions, for example, were looking at a consortia token to try and compete, or at least put their power together. And as a maybe part two to that, was Libra before its time as both a consortia thing and a basket thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. Was Libra before its time? I mean, very possibly. I mean, I do think that they screwed up in multiple ways, right? Like if we look at the practical effect of Libra now, it feels like they basically Sputnik affected the Chinese DCP into existence without actually launching themselves, and that's. So
you're saying they accomplished something?
Basically, I think the challenge was that their approach ended up kind of mirroring the more general failure of the consortium chain approach at the time, which was that it basically inherited the disadvantages of decentralization without really benefiting from the advantages of centralization. And so had they just completely scrapped any notion of doing their own network and just done an ERC20, it would have been much more useful. Yeah, I think the question of what could happen now. So there is one very big place where USDC and USDT are non-competitive, which is that they don't have yield, right? And so if you have a token that has yield like that by itself is a big value add. Going beyond that, there's a subset of users for whom having access to very large scale markets for converting the coin to other things and on-ramps and off-ramps matters a lot. And then there's some subset of users for whom it doesn't really matter as much. So if you launch a new one and then there's some kind of thing, some application that puts it in front of user spaces by default, it'll probably get some people. Yeah, the biggest paths to success, I would say, one is figuring out a way to pay yield. Another is being some currency other than the US dollar, because there are markets, I think especially the more institutional markets for whom that's really useful, right? If you're a company in some country, there's lots of accounting and tax related reasons why it's just most efficient to operate in the local currency.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's I think the path for some new stablecoin to really get big, will probably involve one of those.
This is actually my next question, because it relates to how stables, for example, if most stablecoin volume at the outset of some mass onboarding event were in US dollars, how would it impact, going back to say Celo having 18 local currencies, would they mostly be used for bridging in or bridging out, because there'd be less liquidity, lower volume, and people would want to generally hold what is perceived as more stable assets, whether they be dollar, euro, or basket, or whichever? Or would there need to be these sort of mass onboarding and standardization events for all currencies? What do you think is more likely? I go to Marek for this, since you're watching the use of these different tokens.
Yeah, so when Mento protocol launched all of these, we had this hypothesis that it would lower on and off ramping costs, because the idea was that it's hard to charge a fee. It's hard to, I guess, hide what the fee is when you're onboarding people into a local stablecoin, right? You don't have to factor in an exchange rate anymore. You know exactly what the fee is that's going to be charged. And so we thought that it would be a good way to motivate on and off ramps to kind of lower their fees. And then once people are cashed in, just like you cash in, say, to some centralized exchange with your local currency and then you spend it afterwards, then we thought that people would then spend these local currencies on DeFi, maybe buy US dollar stablecoins or maybe buy yield-bearing stablecoins, whatever they want to do in decentralized applications. We haven't seen that yet really manifest. But we have seen, people, I think, coming up with interesting DeFi use cases for these local stablecoins. So creating ways to let people hedge local currency risk, doing FX trading, all of these different use cases, which I think maybe need to happen first before all of the fees and demand for these local stablecoins really explodes to the point where you can start lowering these fees with these on and off ramps.
Okay, I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit more about peer-to-peer use. So you've both done a lot of traveling in regions that have actually seen upticks in peer-to-peer stablecoin use, oftentimes out of need. Vitalik, I think you've traveled in places in Africa, Buenos Aires, a lot of folks here went to Istanbul. Are you seeing those things as one-offs that are great to have when they're necessary, or is it use that's continued to grow. For example, if it's necessary in one region, the example we talked about in conversation earlier was, let's say it's necessary in the DRC, does it then spread to Republic of the Congo by association? Everybody has friends or relatives or something. How have you seen that proliferate or stay localized? I can go to you first, Vitalik.
I feel like on the specifics, Marek would have like better answers than I do. I mean, I think one thing I would add on top of that is that there's definitely a lot of like regional and even international and like global use of these things, right? And so once crypto becomes like a big part of a financial system in one region, like there's sometimes like people in all kinds of places in that area that end up using it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think anywhere where you don't have, financial rails that are competitive with crypto today, and again, it sounds absurd being in Europe where that isn't the case necessarily. There's really good financial rails here, but there's a lot of places in the world where those aren't competitive, and in those places we're just seeing more and more crypto adoption by consumers, and we're seeing also folks using Web3 rails, using, for example, Celo, to bring capital in from overseas. There's one, just because you asked for examples, there's this one yoga instructor in Malawi who happens to be in the same time zone as Norway, and so he's developed during COVID a customer base of Norwegian yoga students that he teaches, over Zoom. For the Norway to Malawi corridor, there's no real competitive traditional remittance product. And so he receives crypto, he uses MiniPay, and he did some kind of analysis and found that it's something like 30% cheaper than MoneyGram, even if you factor in the on and off ramping fees on both sides. And then the other thing that he really liked is that he didn't have to cash out locally as soon as he got paid. He could just keep it in his wallet in US dollars for when he needed the funds. And so that was a nice way for him to save and hedge local inflation and all of that. And so we're seeing more and more of these use cases, right? I think certainly the big remittance companies are using crypto rails as well to lower their costs. But even though they're doing that, direct peer-to-peer payments are still being able to outprice these folks. And I think, again, that's really exciting because that means that ultimately, everyone in the world will have a self-custodial wallet and will be transacting in a fully decentralized manner. And that's what, just gets me excited.
Mm-hmm. Getting people set up with self-custodied or custodial wallets is complex. I'm going to transition here into identity because mass liquidity, events that come with mass stablecoin adoption can maybe coincide with mass onboarding events. And you guys have also worked on DID project, which is Self. And one thing that came to mind when thinking about this is that way back in the day, PayPal onboarded people by giving you $5 to sign up. We know in this industry that whatever pool is funding that would be empty within probably a block, as somebody would, run a script. So now that we have, we moved through proof of humanity, and the world folks are out here, Self is on stage, and there's all kinds of different innovation that come with, and each approach is unique. How would something like Self be able to help the WhatsAppification, WeChatification of onboarding people en masse if and when the time comes? What's the interplay there when digital identity is actually necessary for interplay with stablecoin and blockchain technologies?
Yeah, so inspired by a lot of Vitalik's writing, we worked hard and invested in a decentralized identity protocol called self.xyz. If you haven't checked it out, definitely take a look. It's an easy domain to remember. And it's a ZK passport protocol, which means that it can prove without a third party and in zero knowledge that you have a valid passport. So you may have seen that passports nowadays have these biometric passport logos on the front. That means that they have a little microchip in them with some data inside that is cryptographically signed with a certificate authority chain leading up to a certificate by your issuing country. And so that means that if you have the certificates of every country in the world, which is not that much data, you can verify the validity of any passport. And so they did this to be able to, or countries did this to be able to make it easier to find counterfeit passports. But it turns out that we can actually use this to create decentralized identity systems on chain, because you can prove that chain, that certificate chain, all of those signatures, signing ultimately your passport data, you can prove that on chain. Now, you wouldn't want to prove it on chain just in a regular smart contract, because then you'd be revealing your passport data to everyone in the world. But if you prove it in zero knowledge, then that becomes really, really interesting. And so that's in effect what Self is. And the reason that we're really excited about Self and just decentralized identity systems in general, comes to the question that Joe just asked. If you think about what brought in waves of users in the past, we've had proof of work initially, right? People bought hardware and they were able to mine Bitcoin and ETH. And effectively be onboarded into these ecosystems. Later on came, yield farming, which allowed people who had capital to come in and earn additional rewards. And I think perhaps the amount of people that had appetite to do that, has probably leveled off. And so we need the next way to onboard, the next large cohort of users. And our hypothesis is that onboarding people who can get a lot of value from being on chain, but may not have the funds to, for example, put into some yield farming protocol to get interested enough to start participating on chain. We think that that's the way to get the next big group of people. And the problem with that is, say that you give out incentives, say that you just give out money for people to create a wallet. That's a really nice way to onboard them. They don't need to put money in that wallet. As soon as they have it, they can, maybe start looking to get paid from overseas using that wallet. But they need some incentive to go through onboarding, right? And if you just give them money, then, to your earlier point, we'd probably have bots who would just take up all the money and we'd be screwed. But if you add Sybil resistance through decentralized identity systems, suddenly you can onboard perhaps even billions of people very, very effectively without the risk of these bots just taking all of that money. And that's, I think, really interesting, especially if you pair it with peer-to-peer payments, right? Peer-to-peer payments only really works if you have a lot of people who are using it and you have these strong network effects. And so we need to get to a point where those network effects turn the smoke that exists today into a fire and eventually onboards everyone. And to do that, we think that, again, these decentralized ID, these Sybil resistance mechanisms can really help to create those, to deploy those incentives in a way that could make that happen.
Thanks. And to Vitalik, do you think that, generally speaking, this is correct and that stablecoin adoption is the potential mass onboarding event for DID systems? Secondarily, do you think that decentralized IDs, digital ID systems, will be winner take most? Imagine, for example, some protocols that are invented in Argentina do really well in Argentina, and others that do well elsewhere, they maybe require some interop. What might that adoption look like?
Yeah, I think the question is the degree to which there are going to be cross dependencies between different users, right? Because if we're thinking about going back to the original kind of motivating topic, DIDs as a way for letting users reliably control their own accounts, that's something that actually doesn't really require that much cross person coordination at all, right? Every person can have their own system and that works totally fine. If we start talking about DIDs as some kind of KYC substitute, then that gets to the point of being something that requires much more widespread adoption to be accepted, and probably something where getting anything that's more unconventional accepted would be much harder. If we're talking about some like internet, like anti-Sybil use case and like veering into more non-financial stuff, then that's probably somewhere in between those two. So I mean, like, I definitely hope that the ZK ID world that we get is like as pluralistic as possible, and I think for me, one of the reasons why is basically that like it would be a better, like the thing that the ZK part of ZK ID solves is it solves like basic privacy. The thing it doesn't solve is it doesn't solve like deplatforming risk, right? Like even with ZK, like, you can still kick people off because like you just force everyone else to prove that they're one of the people that hasn't been kicked off yet. And like technology for that is really easy and it exists already, right? And so if you have multiple overlapping ID systems, then like things get like more robust against that, and like there isn't like this effect where you have one account and you can have only one account. But I mean, obviously, yeah, like having that kind of ecosystem is, in many cases, not a default. I mean, one big reason why I expect that it would happen is just that, like, so far the world is like pretty heterogeneous in terms of what kinds of tech standards get adopted, and so. I do think it's likely that some forms of ID will be more popular in some areas, and in some areas will just feel less need for incorporating that at all, and then other areas will have some other form. And and then people just have to travel to different places, and so like different regions have to have like some way of supporting cross-compatibility with everything. So I could see that happening.
Got it. And okay, I'm going to hard pivot here because we've been talking about two use cases that are semi-intertwined with one another. But this crowd is an interesting crowd because it's very sort of in touch with the Ethereum ecosystem. So there are a lot of users, but also a lot of folks on the builder side. We happen to have on stage somebody who is working with a layer 2 and somebody that has had a lot of involvement, to some at least, with the layer 1. And I wanted to talk about how these use cases, when they see a lot of traffic, come back to impact these networks in different ways. There was a lot of chatter, I'll blab for a second, a lot of chatter in the beginning of the year among two different crowds that had two completely different messages. There was the Twitter bot or the podcast host that would say, haha, gas fees are low, layer 2 model is broken, the network's inflationary. And on the other side, you saw this R&D crowd that was almost in panic mode to scale blobs now, as if there's something coming and one side doesn't see it and the other side is prepping for it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the interplay. With the layer 2 and with the layer 1, how would onboarding events like these drive revenue to a chain like Celo? And then secondarily, to move, so beginning with Marek and then moving to Vitalik, similar instances and events taking place across layer 2s, what do the economics of that look like for the layer 1 as transactions fill up on layer 2s and blobs fill up on layer 1? Just as a bit of an educating piece here as we close it out.
Yeah, I mean, my personal view is that folks in that first camp that you mentioned are being just a little short-sighted, right? I think the opportunity right now is for Ethereum to become the settlement layer of the whole internet. And I think I have a lot of conviction that it is in the pole position to become that. And that's one reason why we transitioned Celo from an L1 to an L2, because we're really excited for that future and we wanted to be part of it and we wanted to contribute to it. And we strongly believe in it. And I think the value that you will get, or that Ethereum will get, by becoming this settlement layer, I think is just orders of magnitude greater than what the value that it can get by scaling, say, the L1 without any L2s. And so I'm personally actually very excited that the L1 is scaling, because I think that's actually good for L2 scaling. But I think ultimately Ethereum will really just propel itself to a completely different league than it is today, just by virtue of having the L2 scaling roadmap fully figured out as it's almost done right now. So that gets me really excited. And then I think to your first question about what value the L2s get, I think at the end of the day, we'll see likely a lot of specialization. We're really focused on these real-world use cases, as we call them. Folks transacting with stablecoins, doing peer-to-peer transactions, but also doing uncollateralized lending, commerce, and other use cases. We're very happy being in this niche, and I think we can do really well in this niche. I think Tether shared some data with us that we're the number 3 chain by daily active users for USDT transactions. And so I think we're the only L2 that has Tether, I think natively deployed on the chain. And so I think within this niche, I think it is a huge niche in and of itself. And we're really happy to really focus on that. And again, have Ethereum be the settlement layer of the Web3, or the whole internet, I should say, which I think is just a really exciting proposition for Ethereum.
And to Vitalik, it's the same question. Maybe it's for the parents watching. It's to better understand as these use cases pick up and stablecoin use and DID use become the norm. What is the interplay there with the roll-up roadmap to the L1? Can you explain just a little bit about how that activity on things like Celo, fill blobs go back to the L1?
Sure. And so, I think there's a few things that are happening, right? So one is that the more just economic activity that there is in happening in things that are naturally close to L1 and that naturally have a lot of interoperability with L1, like that makes it more attractive to build things on L1. It also actually makes things more attractive to build on any L2. Then obviously there are blob fees, though. Like I personally, like if you had to ask me, like to just predict right now if 5 years from now we'd be getting more fees from blobs or from L1 execution, I'd still say L1 execution. Then on the flip side, L1 increasing blobs, it creates more space and it makes it easier for L2s to be secure and for it to be very easy to operate in L2s in a way where L2s just don't have to worry at all about a lot of the guarantees that their users need because basically the blob data does that by default. And another interesting thing that people forget is that actually, even if literally no L2 ever gets anywhere, the blobs actually are also useful for storing L1 data once L1 scales beyond a certain point. So the technology is very dual use in that sense, right? I think in general, a lot of things are dual use between L1 and L2. EVM improvements, an obvious category, right? Like anything that speeds up the L1 EVM, generally, also speeds up the L2 EVM. Then any of the kind of more complicated stuff around account abstraction, privacy protocols, any of these things, they're shared between L1 and L2. Any kind of application wallet related work. So to me, the most important arrow is basically that the bulk of activity that is being done and can be done in the ecosystem is one that benefits Ethereum L1 and Ethereum L2 in lockstep.
Okay. Guys, we covered all 3 topics in a flat 30 minutes. There's a hackathon this weekend, so I'll ask both Marek and Vitalik what all they think you should keep building on as parting words. But otherwise, I defer to you guys for closing thoughts.
Decentralized identity. Check out self.xyz. I think it's a really cool primitive to build with.
Yeah, decentralized identity is great. I'm actually happy to see that it's just advanced so far in maturity over the last 12 months, right? And actually just having Ethereum accounts that are backed by some combination of bridged Web2 to Web3 trust and then your own keys and other things is actually becoming viable now. And also, just doing things with coins and like basic financial stuff, the kinds that we've been doing since 2015. But every year the usability goes up and up, and every year the risk goes down and down. So no, in general, I think it's a very bright future for for Celo and for Ethereum.
Okay, cool. Keep building. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Cool.